All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This day is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity. Kind of like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having those two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Hey everyone, Jody here. It is that week between Christmas and New Year's, hopefully one in which you're getting some time off or some time to catch up on things, or maybe you're right back at it. Over the next week, we're going to be running some special episodes, a couple favorites from 2021, and then a two-part special we recorded looking back at the year, following up on some of the stuff we missed. Now, one quick note, it is the end of the year, so I would be remiss if I didn't point out that we couldn't make this show without the direct support of our listeners. So if you are thinking about some year-end giving, thinking about the things that matter to you this year, consider becoming a member of Radiotopia and supporting this show and all the other shows on the network. You can find a form on our website, thisdaypod.com. Once again, thisdaypod.com if you want to become a member. Anyway, thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting throughout the year. Here we go. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, April 6th, 1712, a group of enslaved people set fire to an outhouse at the home of Peter Van Tilburg on Maiden Lane in what was then the northern edge of New York City. Now, incidentally, for anyone who knows New York City, this was way downtown, but this is a nice reminder that in 1712, the northern edge of New York City is like Soho. But anyway, back to our story. The fire was a signal to others to begin a revolt. And when white people came out of their homes to see what was going on with the fire, they were confronted by a band of something like 25 or 50 enslaved people armed with guns, axes, and knives. Eventually, over the course of this 1712 slave revolt, some 9 white people would be killed and more than 70 black enslaved Americans would be arrested or jailed in the aftermath. So here to talk about the New York City slave revolt of 1712, slavery as an institution in New York City in that era, are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And I should have said newly tenured Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Kellie, you got tenure.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I feel completely relieved.
Yes. If listeners can see a sort of calmer, freer Kellie, if you can hear that quality in her voice, now you know why. In addition to,
Very true. Very true. It feels
Yes.
good. It feels great. Thanks.
All right. Well, but congratulations, seriously. So Kellie, why don't you start here and maybe let's paint a picture of slavery in New York City in the first half of the 18th century.
Sure. I think it's important to let listeners know that in every single colony in America, there was slavery. So even though we tend to think of this as a largely Southern phenomenon, there was a lot of slavery in New York City. In fact, right after South Carolina, New York City held the second position for the largest population of enslaved people. By the time you get to the 1750s, 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5 residents of New York City are enslaved people. So it's a really big deal. I will also say that it looks different than slavery in Virginia or slavery in Maryland, let's say. You don't have large plantations and things of that nature. You have what some scholars have called a more democratized version of slavery, meaning that every person owns about 1 or 2 slaves. So instead of, 5 or 10 people owning 200 or 300 people, now you have every single person owning 1, owning 2, and they are working a myriad of jobs. They're dock workers, they're sailors, they're carpenters and masons. There's not a single active part of labor that an enslaved person wouldn't occupy.
Domestic work.
Yeah, domestic work in particular.
Too, right? Yeah.
And there's not a kind of separation, right? So it's not like you have hundreds or thousands of enslaved people working on a plantation in everyday life. And this is true in other places as well. But in everyday life, enslaved people are working next to free people, and they're working with one another. So it's not just sort of one cohort on one plantation, but there's an intermingling that allows for communication, that allows for friendships. That's, I think, a really important part of this story, but also just of the experience of slavery in New York.
I want to highlight some of those numbers that you mentioned, Kellie, just because, you said 1 in 4, 1 in 5 in 1712, which is the time we're talking about here. We're talking about a New York City population of 8,000 people or so. And if you extrapolate the math and you talk about a rebellion that has a couple hundred people in it, that would be the equivalent today would be a rebellion of, 25,000, 30,000 people, right? So this is when we, that may sound like, a small band, 50, 75, 100 people, but that's actually a massive part of the population. So let's turn to this night, Niki, of April 6th. It starts with this fire that is set to spark things. How do things play out from there?
Yeah, so this had been planned for a while, and it is a pretty carefully planned attack, and you can see that in the way that it plays out. The fire attracts all of these white New Yorkers who come to see what's happening, and when they gather, that's when the enslaved rebels attack, and it gives them the advantage in this fight. And if you just look at the fight itself before the arrests, I mean, they, as you mentioned in the introduction, they killed 9 people. And what they had been hoping to do was to inspire a broader rebellion. So they might have been a band of 25 or 50 people. There might have been more involved in the planning, but they wanted to see the bulk of those 1,000 enslaved people rise up. And that's ultimately where the plan kind of falls apart.
Yeah, slave revolts, particularly in the United States, are so tricky because it's very difficult for them to become successful because you need such large numbers. And even though you might say, well, New York City is a perfect place because there are large numbers, you still have to create buy-in. And when enslaved people don't have arms and they don't have access to things other than farm equipment, making this a successful revolt is a real tall order.
And to that end, if we think of this attempt to spark a larger rebellion, was there already a kind of conversation in the ether about rebellion? What's the metaphor? How much tinder was already there for the spark to work?
Well, I think one of the interesting facts of this revolt is that some of the enslaved people who started this were African born. And I think that makes a really big difference, too, because enslaved who were born on the continent of Africa, a lot of them were already warriors. The slaves who are being traded were prisoners to war. Those were, warriors who lost in battle and then get traded off or kidnapped or used in the slave trade. And so they're not unfamiliar with the practices of battle and warfare and things of that nature. So that makes up a big part of it. I also think that when we think about being able to get a coordinated effort put together in which someone says, I'm not going to snitch, because that's also a big aspect of this too. Almost every single slave rebellion ends with a snitch, or someone saying, well, I don't want my master killed, or I don't want to be implicated in this. And so buying is probably one of the hardest things, because as I mentioned before, the threshold for success is so high.
And the risk is so high, right? That if you get caught, as we see what ultimately happens here, they're not going to go easy on you. The response to slave revolts are so draconian, and they're so harsh that you're asking people not just to risk their lives, but to risk torture and to risk some really obscene responses if they're caught up in the dragnet afterwards.
And a little of that happens here, which we'll get to. But I'm curious about the revolt itself. I mean, rebelling against slavery is its own end. But I also am curious kind of about other ends here. I mean, when you think of slave revolts in the South, there's potentially escape to the North. Here, this is the North, right? So I'm wondering what is the escape? What is the overthrow? What is the rebellion at the end of this?
That's a good question. It's kind of unclear, because everybody has their own motivations for rebelling. Some of it's just individual revenge against their masters or their mistresses. Some of it is an ability to gain more rights or freedoms for themselves, so that people will see them as a threat and perhaps want to treat their enslaved property differently. But it's not clear what could happen as a result of this, because the idea of emancipation was not something that was at the forefront. I mean, this is before the American Revolution, so no one's thinking about liberty, equality, and all of these revolutionary ideals that we think of much later, towards the end of the century. So it's not known.
Yeah, and the timing matters here too, because there's also so much of what would become the United States that doesn't have any sort of formal settlement. So the idea of just kind of disappearing into the continent is much more possible, I think, at this point. And so you could imagine just a successful revolt that just ends in disappearing into other parts of the continent.
So we have our revolt. There is a response both from white soldiers and the state, but also armed bystanders. And they sweep the city for rioters and capture many of them. All this, again, happening in sort of what is now downtown Manhattan, what is now kind of Chinatown, that area. As we said, 9 whites were killed in the riot, 6 were wounded. And let's start to get into some of the crackdown in the aftermath here. About 40 enslaved people are brought to trial. Niki, what is that crackdown? You started to describe it earlier.
Yeah, I mean, well, first and foremost, the execution of those who were found guilty were pretty obscene, right? It was torture. They were burned alive. They were starved to death. They were crushed. I mean, these were pretty brutal executions. And then for the people who were still alive and for the people who weren't part of the revolt, there's a real legal crackdown in what people are able to do. You have this point where enslaved people are no longer able to hold firearms. They're no longer able to gather in groups of 3. They're no longer allowed to gamble, I guess, because it's too much freedom. And this idea of trying to strip away any opportunities for enslaved people to talk to one another and to plot, as well as a form of punishment.
This is really indicative of the response that almost all slave rebellions had, and not even just slave rebellions, but rumored rebellions. They almost always led to mass executions, mass hangings. Women were not spared in this either. There's a woman who was pregnant. They wait till she has her child and then they execute her. And so there's no mercy that's really held out for anyone. This is really one strike and you're out. They had a zero tolerance policy for how they imbued this violence against enslaved people who even rumored rebellions. And I think that's really important to know. There are people who are executed based off of rumors. This was an actual revolt, but it just goes to show you how violent things can get so quickly.
There's one other law that we should mention, and that is a law that was put in place after the revolt that said you could only free someone you had enslaved if you paid a tax of 200 pounds per person, which was actually a price that was much higher than the price of buying someone who was enslaved. And so what they were doing was they were putting this enormous tax on freedom to prevent people from freeing enslaved people. It was a way of sort of keeping down the population of free blacks in New York, and also of just continuing to codify this system of enslavement, and making sure that it was permanent and that there wasn't a path to freedom.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think the stronghold that slavery had on all of the United States, if there was a precedent that was created, well, we'll just free them, then the whole system could collapse. Then any revolt that could lead to emancipation was a bad move on the part of slaveholders. And so ensuring that even people who wanted to do the right thing couldn't afford it, not just politically, but economically, was something that was very intentional.
Slavery is not outlawed in New York until 1799, until the end of the 18th century. I'm sure we'll find a chance to do an episode about that. But Kellie, very briefly, kind of, can you paint the sketch of what happens between the early part of the century and the late part of the century that then New York ends up outlawing it?
Yeah, there are a number of revolts that take place in the 18th century. And I think the difference is that oftentimes those revolts are about seeking individual freedom or freedom for a group of people or freedom for a particular town. It's not necessarily about overthrowing the entire system. But by the time you get to the 19th century, Nat Turner's rebellion is about an overthrow of the entire system. Gabriel Prosser's plot and all of that, these really bigger or potentially bigger rebellions are about eradicating the system altogether. And I think that's the difference from when slavery is still sort of forming or hardening within this newly formed, what is to become America. And then once America is America, it's about completely overthrowing the
because
system.
By that point, it's much more systemic, right?
Oh, much more systemic and larger. You know, I mean, there are 4 million people who are enslaved by the time of the Civil War.
Why does New York end slavery in 1799?
So I will say that it's complicated and it varies in every state throughout the North. But as we get to the American Revolution and even after the American Revolution, African Americans have ideas. They have co-opted these ideas about what freedom and liberty and equality mean. There are cases in which Black people are suing for their freedom. There are soldiers who fought in the American Revolution and are also saying, hey, I too should be free. And so throughout the North, you do get large pockets of Black people gaining their freedom, obtaining their freedom, either through military service or through the courts. And it starts the long erosion of Black people gaining their freedom and eventually complete emancipation throughout the North. But I don't know. Everybody in the North starts to end slavery. But it's everyone in the North is industrializing and becoming more urban, and it's just a different way of living. But I can't necessarily, I'm sure there are scholars that have written about why.
I just realized that I didn't know, and I was like, maybe there's an easy answer to this.
No, I think it just changes based on necessity and based on the market. And the fact that there's no plantations, I think is, they have Wall Street to do that work.
Yeah. Well, that's a very good answer, but I also think listeners, the last minute, that's the sound of us deciding on a future segment where we will dig into this and find a hook because, I'm very fascinated by that sort of change in around 1790 to 1800. But that brings us to the end of this episode. So, Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kala Nakua helps with our transcripts, which you can find at thisdaypod.com. Also on our website, I don't mention this often enough, but you can also find our theme music there. If you want to download it, you can download it there. A number of people have reached out and asked about the theme music. Follow us on social media. We're posting a bunch of stuff at thisdaypod on Instagram and Twitter every day. Thanks again to everyone who has reached out with comments and questions and potential topics. You can email us thisdaypod@gmail.com. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon. Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's ODOO.com/thisday.
Radiotopia.